Today I have a bowl of potatoes because I want to know if potatoes taste better if they're fermented. I've always heard of this method of preparing potatoes and people seem to rave about it. I've done little or no research on fermenting potatoes other than a couple videos I saw a few years ago, but I've never actually tried it myself until now, and the results even surprised me. My potatoes were pretty dirty with the soil still on, so I went ahead and gave them a wash and a scrub. I like my potatoes with the skin on since I like the crunch they give, so I'm going to leave them on and cut the potatoes into halves and quarters depending on the size of potato. The larger potatoes I'll cut into quarters and the smaller potatoes I'll only cut into halves, but really I'm trying to make every chunk as even as possible. Once I've cut all my potatoes, I'm going to give them another quick rinse under cold water to remove some excess starch. I've set a glass flip top jar onto a scale which I've zeroed out to the weight of the jar, since we only really want to record the weight of the stuff that's in the jar and not the jar itself. And to the bottom of the jar, I've thrown in a couple bay leaves and I'm going to grind some black peppercorns as well. I'll add my potatoes to the jar as well, and it should hold our seasonings down. Once the jar is filled with potatoes, leaving a little bit of space at the top, I'll fill the jar with filtered room temperature water until all the potatoes are covered. And then take note of the weight of everything I just added, which ended up being about 1,680 grams. So that is the weight of the black pepper, the bay leaf, the potatoes, and the water that was added to the jar. Now I want to do a 3% lacto ferment here, so that will be 3% of the weight of everything I've just added to the jar. And to find 3%, we can simply multiply that 1,680 grams that we recorded earlier with 0.03, which is equal to 3%. And that will tell us in grams how much salt we need to add to our jar for a 3% brine, which ended up being about 50 grams of salt. So to the jar, I'll add that 50 grams of salt. I'm using sea salt, but any 100% natural salt works well for fermenting. Before I push the lid down, I'll remove my scales not to damage it, and then I'll clip the lid down on my jar and shake to help dissolve some of the salt. You don't really need to dissolve all the salt straight away, but as it sits and ferments, the salt should completely dissolve into the water. I ended up leaving my potatoes to ferment for about a week. I basically kept watching it to see when the fermentation bubbles started to die down, and every so often, I'd just give it a sniff to see how fermented it is. But with all that dirt on the outside of the potatoes and having left the skins on, this started fermenting fairly fast and fairly vigorously as well. And weirdly, the potatoes seem to have maybe shrunken a little bit, or something has made them sort of collapse down into the jar. About after a week of fermenting, I figured it was probably best not to push this too far on the fermenting, so I separated them from the brine and then using some kitchen towel, patted each potato piece dry. The potatoes had also become quite soft and pliable, sort of like the texture of potato that's gone wrinkly from being stored wrong. At this point, no matter how delicious this turns out, I was still kind of wondering to myself if this would be worth all the labor that goes into making fermented potatoes, but of course I am who I am and I am curious, so I'll go through all this work to ferment a few potatoes. Now in order to try to get a little more crunch on the outside of potatoes, I tossed them in some oil and decided not to season the potatoes since they still had some black pepper on them and the salty brine would have made them a little bit salty. I also decided to test these against my go-to method of preparing potatoes, which is simply cutting up potatoes with the skin on, boiling them until soft, tossing in oil, seasoning before roasting in the oven or in an air fryer. I split this baking tray into halves. One side is the fermented potatoes and the other side is my usual go-to method, and I roasted the potatoes until they were crispy and cooked throughout. Now, my go-to way of roasting potatoes creates a crunchy outside with a nice fluffy inside, while the fermented potatoes seems to have this strange sheen on the outside. And despite for sure being cooked right the way through, they seemed a little bit rubbery inside. Also, there seems to be quite a color difference between the fermented and the non-fermented potatoes, with the fermented potatoes being a little darker on the inside. Now it's time to taste these, and first I'll try my go-to, which were crunchy, fluffy, and delicious. Hence, they're my go-to. And now for the fermented potatoes. First thing I noticed is that while the skin had some crunch, it wasn't a very fluffy crunch and more like a rigid crunch, almost like biting into thin plastic. And then the second thing that hit me was the saltiness. The fermented potatoes were quite too salty for me, and not just on the outside. The salty brine had definitely managed to make its way into the potato, making it quite salty all the way through. Now, the third thing that hit me was a sort of stale off taste, which was strong enough to be quite prevalent and quite unenjoyable. I've heard people describe fermented potatoes as being like a salt and vinegar chip, but these were not it. So I'm starting to wonder if I did it wrong. I even tried boiling the fermented potatoes and then roasting, hoping the boiling may remove some of the saltiness and maybe create a fluffy outside texture, but still the potatoes came out rubbery, salty, and a little bit stale. So I actually decided to look into it a little bit finally, and repeat the process. This time, I'm cutting my potatoes into sticks, sort of French fry style, and I decided not to wash the excess starch off the potatoes. I also decided to forgo the seasonings and just add the potatoes directly into a jar that I've zeroed on my scale. I added filtered water until all the potatoes were covered, took note of the weight, and decided to do a 2% brine instead, especially after how salty my 3% brine came out. My water and potatoes came out to 1,096 grams, which I'll multiply by 0.02 to get our weight in salt, which came out to be about 22 grams of salt, which again, I'm using sea salt. I added the salt to the jar, closed it up and gave it a little shake before setting it aside to ferment. During my research, I saw a post on Reddit Fermentation mentioning that anywhere from 3 to 5 days of fermenting works well. So I decided to leave my potatoes to ferment for 5 days. And during that time, these fermented very fast and very vigorously again. The smell this time, however, was much more pleasant and tangy than before. I again strained the potatoes, and you can see just how flexible these have become. And again, I used some kitchen towel to dry off the potatoes, tossed them in some oil and seasoned with just black pepper. This time I decided to air fry these potatoes at 180 degrees Celsius for about 20 minutes, making sure to give them a toss every so often to get all the sides crisping up. These were looking a lot more promising now, with a much nicer, crispier looking outside. I broke one in half, and this seems a lot fluffier than before, and the color is looking a little bit better as well. Giving these a taste, they're still too salty, and at this point I'm wondering if I've developed an intense sensitivity to salt, or if people are genuinely enjoying this level of saltiness. These still taste far better than my first attempt, but after all that work, I think I prefer the taste of my freshly boiled potatoes and then roasted potatoes. And if I do want to make them taste a little bit more like salt and vinegar chips, like how I've heard them being described, I think I'll just season them with salt and vinegar. So would I say fermenting potatoes are worth it? No. But I'd also love to hear any feedback and maybe ways to actually get a good tasting fermented potato in the comments. And if there's any other fermentation recipes you want me to try, leave them down there as well.